Hey folks, do you remember Anthem, that obscure BioWare shooter that released a few years ago? Well, I've got some new— Wait, what, Craig? What? It came out this year? Oh, shit. Yes, Anthem, the looter shooter that nobody's talking about, has some news, and that news is, well, I mean, it's not great news for Anthem. Basically, they're abandoning their big roadmap. They were going to have that roadmap full of exciting acts, because that's what so many of these live service games promise themselves on. They come out, they launch half-baked, but they say there's content coming, we've got a roadmap. And I always roll my eyes, and this is exactly why I roll my eyes when video games launch with scant content but promises of so much post-launch support. What publishers and developers don't tell you when they promise they'll be supporting a game for years to come is that support is conditional. There are many modifying circumstances that can change the nature of a game's post-launch support. One such modifier may be the game being a buggy, broken mess that the developers have to spend time fixing instead of updating with new stuff to do. And the one that I consider the biggie is that the game actually has to have a measure of success for the publisher to want to invest in it. Continued support for a video game is an investment on behalf of the companies producing the game. And if they're not getting the returns on that investment, they're not gonna support it. So when you're buying a live service video game with a roadmap of content, you may very well be purchasing a bill of goods. You are purchasing the promise that a game will be fleshed out and finished and realized by the end of its roadmap, but what publishers aren't telling you when they sell you these games is that the promise is very easily broken for any number of reasons. These roadmaps are built on sand. They can sink very easily. This is exactly why I lost a significant measure of interest in Square Enix's Avengers game the moment they said they'd be supporting the game for years to come. I just don't believe it anymore. It may very well come to pass, but when the game industry promises me anything long term, I just don't believe it, because this is a short-term industry with short-term goals. It doesn't think in terms of years, it promises in terms of years, but the mainstream game industry has proven time and time again that it can't see in front of its own nose. The flimsy unreliability of a video game roadmap is just one of many reasons why the live service gold rush has been a crock of shit. But anyway, back to Anthem. I was actually gonna deploy that rant a little later in the video, but the spirit overcame me. Back to Anthem. It will be getting updates, but not in the roadmapped, act-based way that players were promised. Anthem stumbled at the first hurdle when Act 1 of its roadmap was supposed to be implemented in March. Well, that got delayed, and then the rest of the acts weren't spoken of again. According to a new blog post by developer BioWare, that whole idea is out the window now. There are no more act-based. This sweeping roadmap isn't happening anymore. There will instead just be seasonal updates to the game as BioWare scales back its content ambitions and focuses on addressing core issues. In a blog post by BioWare's Chad Robertson titled "What is next for Anthem?" he had this to say. So, what's next for Anthem? We hear your concerns, I love it when they say that, on core issues in Anthem and are acting on it. Those systems require a more thorough review and reworking versus quick fixes. We've got a team working on that now, and early results are promising. In order to address these long-range plans, we are moving away from the Acts structure for updates. Did you ever move towards it? Instead, we have additional seasonal updates planned for this year that we think players will enjoy. These events will deliver challenges and chases similar to what you've seen, and are built around some fun themes we're bringing to the game. As I've said previously, we want to be transparent with you that we know more work needs to be done to make Anthem better. We also want to ensure we're backing up our words with a great game you can play. That's in bold. Ooh, so I don't have any news today to share about the long-term changes we are bringing to Anthem. What I can say is that we will continue to engage with you, our community, through PTS when we can show you what is coming. All in all, pretty vague as Anthem reaches the end of its Cataclysm event, and when I say Cataclysm, I'm talking about a specifically named event, not Anthem itself being a cataclysmic event, although it's easy to get the two things confused. All players really know is that more content is planned, more content is coming, but it is not the roadmap that was promised, as BioWare continues to work on core issues, core problems with the game itself, which was notoriously launched half-baked and, well, a little bit shit. Anthem has by and large been a bit of a disaster for BioWare. Its development was notoriously troubled, as noted in a by now famous Kotaku report. It failed to build much pre-launch hype, it had very little to show for itself at press conferences, and Electronic Arts had burned so much customer goodwill with Star Wars Battlefront 2 that I certainly could count myself among those who couldn't trust Anthem in the least. And the game itself is just mediocre rubbish, made worse by the fact that they did plan all this content and that got delayed and bugs had to be fixed instead. And even with this new statement from BioWare, the future for Anthem looks really quite uncertain, especially as stuff moves on to games like Dragon Age 4. Like I said earlier, this stuff is conditional. The promise of a game fleshing itself out and being what was promised, becoming what was promised, is simply not something any game company can reasonably guarantee. You'll have some success stories, some surprises, like No Man's Sky eventually, after a long time, becoming what a lot of people wanted. But just look at how many early access games on Steam get abandoned. And sometimes the reasoning for this is, well, reasonable. I hate to say reason and reason in the same sentence together, but sometimes the reasons are reasonable. Plans change, the market changes. But if you are buying a video game, don't buy a content-lacking video game on the promise that the content will come. Because the moment that the investment turns out to not be worth it for any mainstream publisher, they're not going to support something just because they said they would. It's one of the many ways in which an untrustworthy set of companies trade on trust. Trust us, we've got a roadmap, we know where we're going. Now give us upwards of $60, which of course is upwards of. If you're spending that kind of money, if you spend the kind of money that one spends on a finished video game, you should get a finished video game in return. These early triple access games, as I call them, these AAA video games that are threadbare in terms of content, that were rushed out the gate and plan to fill in the glaring gaps later, are basically a con job until they're finished, until they're worth what they're charging. At least with an early access game, they're in the early access section and they're labeled early access, and when you buy them, you know they're early access. Some of these so-called AAA games, do you remember when they came up with AAA, it was supposed to be a benchmark of quality, it was supposed to be a label that indicated that benchmark? Some of these so-called AAA games are not labeling anywhere that they're incomplete and plan to finish themselves later. And as we've seen in games with unfulfilled roadmaps, even if they do plan to finish themselves off, those plans are always subject to change and often subject to disappointment. Anthem is a disaster. More like, Crantham. I don't know what that means.